Welcome to the Presbyterian Church in Westfield, New Jersey, meeting us, as so many are these days, online. For the next 3 weeks, we're going to be studying how a handful of phrases that we are taught as children are not only part of the Sermon on the Mount, but how they are often attributed within daily life and in terms of the lessons they learn, the wisdom they are meant to instill in very different ways than Jesus intended. Today, we talk about turning the other cheek, and this truly is a phrase that deserves some attention. In our scriptures this week, we study one little phrase, one little line out of the Sermon on the Mount that often isn't even recognized to be a part of it. Hear now Jesus' words. You've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer, but if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also.
And refresh my eyes, Lord, and refresh my vision. Refresh my heart, Lord, and be now my vision, Lord, my vision.
The world as it stands right now seems as though it would be much improved if adults would stop acting like a bunch of kindergartners. At least this is what I hear, it seems, on the news a lot. It seems that we're misbehaving left and right. But Robert Fulghum, the author of All I Need to Know I Learned in Kindergarten, would probably argue against us. In fact, the whole point of his book was that the world would be a better place if adults lived by the lessons we learned in early childhood. I think this is a wonderful thing for us to be thinking through today. Back in that book, before we dive into our stuff, back in that book, you have this wonderful set of lessons of cleaning up after yourself, something I'm still terrible at, of being kind to one another, learning to play with each other, and learning to play nice. And wrapped up in this whole story is a lesson that I'm sure most of us learned along the way, turning the other cheek. Of course, the way that we learned it was to turn the other cheek in terms of, again, learn to make peace, to forgive and forget, let things go, make peace with people. It wasn't all that bad, really, even if it was. For so many of us, these lessons have been stripped away from their original context. This word, this phrase of turning the other cheek. We might know it's scripture. We might even know it's Jesus. We might even know that, didn't that come out of the Sermon on the Mount? But if you got that far, probably the real meaning of it still typically stands in this place of forgive and forget. Drop it. Let it go. And the real issue I think that's going on with that is that all these lessons that we were taught in those early childhood development years, kindergarten, etc., is to turn us into well-adjusted adults. The problem is that what Jesus is talking about is something very different. And Dr. Martin Luther King, back in the 1950s, gave us an articulation of how to hear, how to read into Jesus' words from the Sermon on the Mount specific to this phrase, and gives them new life. You see, back then, he was invited out to Berkeley, California, and he went to go speak to the YMCA and YWCA communities there. So he travels out to California, and later, this speech, which otherwise may have actually gotten lost, ends up finding its way into a compendium of his speeches and his writings that is called Testament of Hope. The editor's last name is Washington, and it's worth looking up. It's phenomenal, really thick book, but it contains some of the greatest writings that Dr. King ever had. This speech actually ends up being, I believe, the first of the essays. And in it, here's what he does. Dr. King is reflecting on what it means to not fight back, for peaceful resistance. And he starts by talking about how the whole point of peaceful resistance is actually not simply about taking peaceful means of getting what you want. What it means is starting with understanding that the brokenness that is causing the conflict is hurting both parties. I'm going to say that again. When you are under attack, both parties are being hurt by it. Both yours and the attacker's humanity is being harmed. And he talks about it from that perspective of saying that to be peaceful in the way that one resists is a way of honoring that both are being hurt, and you're not willing to take part in creating more hurt. He goes on to talk about love, and he talks about love not as a sentiment, not as a feeling, not nothing passionate, but being an act of justice. In fact, I think most of Christian history has actually called justice or thought of justice as love put into action. And as Dr. King reflects on this, he reflects on the way in which God is at work in the world, and that every act of peaceful resistance, every act of justice, where a harm received is not a harm returned. That all of this is playing into and is becoming part of what God is already up to in the world. And then he does something wonderful. All of this has been great, but he does something wonderful at the end. He talks about how psychologists, psychiatrists, etc., those in the medical field that deal with human mental conditions, name that being maladjusted to society can lead to psychosis. And then he says, there are some things in our society I am proud, he says, for which I am maladjusted. He names segregation and discrimination and says, to these I am maladjusted, and I hope you are too. So we have these lessons that we learn early in our childhood, all to make us well-adjusted adults. And yet, it seems, at least on the surface, that one of Jesus' key teachings has become a way of making us well-adjusted for entering into polite society, when in fact it might be there to do something very, very different. Some of those who have tried to come to grips with what Jesus has talked about have gone on to talk about all sorts of things about, non-retaliation and not seeking revenge on a personal level, but instead allowing for the state or the government, etc., to take justice, on its own, not taking justice into your own hands. And that's all well and good, but those who have tried thinking about this in other ways actually seem to resonate more with me. If you're not already familiar at home with the theologian and ethicist, and I don't expect you necessarily are, but the theologian and ethicist Walter Wink, he's worth reading. He has this great book in which he talks about this very idea. In fact, he directly quotes the reading from today and also a line that comes immediately after. And what he does with it is just simply amazing. He says that by turning the other cheek, we're forcing the attacker to treat us as an equal. Now, this doesn't really make sense in today's society because by and large, on a day-to-day basis, culturally at least, we do not think highly of individual person-to-person acts of violence. But he's talking about in the first century and just thereafter. And often what would happen is a Roman soldier or somebody who's at least just a higher class or a higher position in society, when striking somebody of a lower position in society, would use the back of their right hand, never the left, because they use that for unclean purposes like the toilet. So if you turn the other cheek, they're forced to either use their unclean hand or to strike you with an open hand. You're forcing them to treat you like an equal. Well, this is really empowering. I think it's important for us to hear because so much of this turning the other cheek language has actually been used to teach, or maybe not intentionally, but has taught those who have been abused to deal with their abuse. And in some cases even, to tell those who have been abused that they need to forgive their abuser, often years before they're in a position to do so. So this idea, I think, has a lot of energy to it. And he goes on to talk even about the next line. Again, it doesn't show up for today, so I hope it doesn't distract, but he talks about if you're getting sued by a creditor, and of course he's talking about in those days, if they come after your coat, give them the shirt off your back. And what Walter Wink then does with it is he says, listen, then, as now, society tends to look down on being naked in public. In fact, it's a crime in the first century. So Jesus is effectively telling his people, if someone comes after you taking the shirt off your back, when you give them the tunic and you're standing there naked, you have forced them to break the law. Again, both of these views being really empowering. But if we go beyond where Walter Wink stands, but then he takes it much further as well as a way of undermining power systems and such. There are other thinkers, and Dr. King is one of them, that dive deeply into this idea of what does it mean to have been attacked, to take something from somebody, not always just physically, but to take on suffering in such a way that it stands on the rooftops and shouts out, I am maladjusted to what is happening. I am not okay with what is happening. In our society, we tend so much to think about the world in terms of being a place where violence simply happens. It's a part of things, and quite frankly, those who do violence only listen to violence. So violence has to meet violence in order to put it down. And in this world, Jesus is calling on his followers to do something radically different. To use their own suffering, to use their own position, to use what is happening to stand up and peacefully say, this way of living cannot stand. Dr. King himself is also commonly quoted for turning a quote that is often attributed to Gandhi, and it's a quip on Hammurabi's Code. So Hammurabi's Code, for the uninitiated at home, he was a king, an emperor over Babylon, I believe, or Persia, who penned the first royal laws. And they make their way, actually, into the Old Testament, in at least two different places, Exodus and Leviticus. And the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, or the lex talionis, the eye for an eye, is a way of saying that punishment will be doled out equal to the crime and the severity of the crime. Well, that's a wonderful phrase for structuring a society and things like that, but we really live by it. We think in terms of it. And to mete out revenge upon something, to mete out that as justice, stands very opposed to the kind of justice that Jesus speaks to. And so reflecting on that, at least it's been attributed to Gandhi, it says that a tooth for a tooth and an eye for an eye leaves the world blind and toothless. King had said that very same thing about our country, and I wish I could remember who it is, but one of the preachers of the civil rights movement, who is also very well known, very well regarded, and an influencer alongside of Dr. King, was found to have said that an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth leaves all the world blind and gnawing on their biscuits. The sense of time and again, from potentially everybody from Gandhi to Dr. King to other people in our society, those who follow Christ at least, have recognized, have been able to see that there really is no wisdom to this idea of meting out violence in return for violence. And so I suppose, like Christ has said, we're being invited to live in a different way than the rest of the world, to live in a different way from our neighbors, to live in a way in which, when we are faced with so much conflict around us, we are invited out to say that we are maladjusted to the world as it is being lived, that we are being invited to offer the world a new way. As children, we are taught to turn the other cheek as a way of placating a situation or of making nice with our friends, of forgetting, putting it all behind us. I think Jesus is calling us to shine a light on it, to stand aside and say, I will not let this have power over me. What is happening is not okay. Today is a call to be maladjusted. Amen.